talk in stories. When we are sharing stories to our children, we do that in stories. When we are listening to our traditions or listening to the stories from our grandmothers or our parents, we listen to stories. And we're constantly collecting the stories of our traditions, of where we come from. Even if we decorate a front porch, we're telling a story. So I'm of a kind of a belief that storytelling, would you mind coming a little bit closer, if you wouldn't mind, just come a little bit closer so I'm not shouting too much. I'm of a kind of belief that storytelling is a radical gift of hope that can enrich the world and hopefully change it. And I say that because storytelling has been such an important part of my upbringing, my identity. You heard about the National Storytelling Festival that began in 1973. Around that same time, and it was before I was born, there was a different event that was happening to my own family. So about 1972, my own family lived in Uganda. And on that particular summer of 1972, there was an announcement on Ugandan public radio by the then dictator Idi Amin. And he announced that all Ugandan Asians had 3 months to leave the country or they'd all be executed. So that was my entire family. Everyone that I knew, I wasn't born yet, but my entire family. But around 50,000 people had to flee the borders, and they had 3 months to flee the borders. But in that time period, they had no help from the government, no help from the army, no help from anybody or the police. So you can imagine the community was left very vulnerable. Well, my parents, because they were born officially when the country was a part of the British colony, they were British citizens. So they had the right to come to Britain. But they were robbed en route to the airport. And when they arrived, they were met by the far-right neo-Nazi groups that took everything that they had from them. But they arrived in a small town called Eastbourne in 1972, and the headline of that paper, the Eastbourne Herald, read, "Eastbourne welcomes Ugandan refugees," and my parents are on that front page of that paper holding a little baby, who's my older brother, 4 years older than me. They were kind of like this kind of cool young couple. 4 years later, I was born. Now I'd say that because here as a community, here's my own family, my own parents, my own family that had to flee the borders. And you see that in the news today with refugees from Syria or in Colombia, all across, even in this country when we're fleeing places like hurricanes or disasters. You may not be able to take your possessions or your money or your objects or your churches or your mosques or your synagogues, but one thing no one can ever take away from you are your stories. Now I understand the stories of my traditions that go back thousands of years. When I grew up in South England, I was at the time when it wasn't cool to be brown. And I was being picked on in school playgrounds and had to face neo-Nazis by myself. But one thing that was being revealed to me through the stories of my family in family gatherings was the stories of heritage. So when someone called me a smelly immigrant, I said, no, I come from a tradition of warriors. A tradition of people that took down the largest empire the world has ever known. My people did that. And they're simple, rural people from northern India. So it instilled a sense for me that I didn't necessarily need material things in my life. What I could use is the power of storytelling, the power of my own stories. So my trajectory, how did I come to Jonesborough? So that's another, I didn't plan it. I said, like, when I grew up in South England, well, I'm going to be in Jonesborough, Tennessee. I'm going to run the International Storytelling Center. That wasn't kind of how I planned it, but that's this is where I ended up. I became a teacher. I became a high school teacher, and I was working in East London. And in East London, where the kids are all taller than me, but one of the things I did was I wasn't teaching art. I was helping young people to tell their stories through hip hop, through music, through poetry, through painting, through all different types of art forms, through foodways. There's many different ways that we can tell our stories, and what that showed to me that if we allow people, especially young people, to harness their own potential, to tell their own stories in their own way, they can be anything they want to be. I moved to Scotland in 2001, and this is around the time when, I moved to Scotland on a total whim, basically. And I was living in a hippie commune, and there was 18 of us. We were all called Zargonauts, and we lived in the house of Zargonia. We ate organic food, and we hugged each other like we're kin. And we had lots of parties. It was fun, and it was, lots of stuff happened. It was great. And then, September 2001, on the TV, we watched the Twin Towers collapse. There was a moment that I remember, that exact moment where I was, and I'm sure all of you remember exactly where you were, the time of day, what was the light like when you found out about that moment. And that was a moment for me where I realized I was no longer a citizen of one country. I was a citizen of the world, and that my world mattered. I decided that in that moment, I didn't want to go back. I didn't want to retreat 30, 40 years in terms of multicultural understanding, this idea that we're all striving to live towards. But unfortunately, the knock-on effect of the impact of that was people became suspicious of one another. A few months after 9/11, there was an attack on a mosque and also a synagogue, not by each other, but by people that were trying to stamp out difference. So I phoned up, I took out the yellow pages, and I was now working for the National Museum of Scotland. And my job was to present Scotland to the world and the world to Scotland. So I phoned every place of worship in Scotland, and I invited them into the museum. And I created an event 6 months after 9/11 called Side by Side, a celebration of world faiths in Scotland. We had Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, Buddhists, Baha'is, Christians, Catholics, Protestants, Brahmo Kumaris, pagans, all different people, 6,000 people that came together to share their stories, their food, their traditions, their music. We had Jewish Scots, third generation Jewish Scots that played Celtic music, combined it with klezmer traditions, and called their band Celtic Schmeltigan. We had Sikh drummers that wore the Scottish Sikh tartan and played the Scottish bagpipes. But that event, a single event, kind of ignited an idea that these communities have something important. You won through storytelling. They could explore their identity as Scots, but also explore and celebrate the differences with different faith traditions. That project led me to come to the United States, I'm conscious of time, come to the United States around 2011, and I embarked on a World Peace Scholarship program at the University of North Carolina, focusing on storytelling and international development, conflict resolution, the power of storytelling to transform lives and transform society. And the way we do it, a simpler way, I can give you all an academic thesis, or I can just basically tell you this. 3 people walk into a bar, a politician, a banker, and a construction worker. They don't sit at the bar and talk in facts. They talk in stories. They build connection. They build a sense of belonging and an equal platform. Imagine if our countries around the world, or our groups divided in this nation right now, could learn to do the same thing. And that's the power of storytelling. 2 years doing my fellowship at University of North Carolina, I'm sitting at a table in Chapel Hill, and my professor turns around and says, "What's next?" And I said, "Well, I don't really want to go back to Scotland, it's too cold. I've been there, I'm looking for a big opportunity." And then someone else turned around and said, "There's a job going at the International Storytelling Center. They produce the National Storytelling Festival. It's in Jonesborough, Tennessee." And my first thoughts were, there's a festival dedicated to this art form. And where the hell is Jonesborough, Tennessee? I Google mapped it, and I realized it was only 4 hours away. I applied for this job, and I thought, what, will they actually take me as the person to run this institution? But I thought to myself, just be yourself, it's all you can be. Tell your story. Be exactly who you are and talk about what you want to bring. And I was invited here for an interview. And obviously I'm not an American citizen, so they had to advertise it out. But I don't know, something that I said worked, that I was offered the job. And about 3 weeks later, I moved to Jonesborough. I decided this is the base. And why the International Storytelling Center? Because it's the institution that led the movement, and it's the world's oldest institution that ignited a movement that is now in every town and every city, every country in the world. And this is the birthplace of it. In 1973, my predecessor, Mr. Jimmy Neal Smith, came up with a bold idea to create a storytelling event. Now he said, and I meet with him for breakfast every week. And he said that he never tried to create a storytelling movement. He was trying to save a dying mountain town. He was listening to Jerry Clower's stories on the radio with kids that he was teaching. And they were laughing and joking and said, well, if we can make a community here in this car, imagine what we could do if we create a festival. And he boldly called it the National Storytelling Festival, which was incredibly bold, because only 80 people came. But that's pretty good for 1973. He invited mountain men storytellers called Ray Hicks. And these are the traditions of stories told in these mountains that some of these stories are even forgotten about in places where they came from, like the British Isles. But they've been kept alive through a diaspora of people that have lived in these mountains for a long time. He brought Ray Hicks down from the mountains and they performed around the main street of Jonesborough. And the idea spread across the country. And people told about there's a movement, there's something happening, there's appreciation for an art form. The next year more people came, and then more people came. And then it ignited a national movement that now the festival hosts around 10,500 people for 3 days, every October. And it's the world's largest single event exclusively devoted to the art form of storytelling. But what Jimmy Neal also did was come up with another bold idea, was to create an international storytelling center in a small mountain town, with the idea that we might be positioned here. We're not in DC or Paris or New York or San Francisco. We're in this town, but we have something to offer the world, and that is this art form. So my work is, of course, I oversee these public programs, but now it's much more about stories know no boundaries. We can work anywhere in the world. The International Storytelling Center is now working with the Pentagon to help this country realize an alternative to war, helping to shape a curriculum for all the US military, so that when they go engage in war, there's an alternative, a different narrative that we can tell for this country that can prevent this country from going to war, and also preventing conflicts and build better relationships with our friends from across the world. We work with the United Nations, and we create programs internationally to present storytellers for International Day of Peace. We've worked with Harvard University to create storytelling resources, to create a field for storytelling in health, in education, in science. We work with NASA Jet Propulsion Lab to tell the stories of innovation and science and excite young kids in this nation about going to space. And my favorite, which I'm really proud of, is that we also get to work with Her Majesty the Queen of America, Miss Dolly Parton. And she is the Queen, and she is an incredible storyteller, also because she has a rags to riches story. She's someone that came from poverty, as you know. But what did she do? She could have accepted a narrative that she was poor and she wasn't worth much more than that. But she didn't. She believed in herself. She harnessed her whole potential to tell her own story in her own way. And then she followed her dream, and she made it. And then she gave back to her community. So our role, our mission, is to empower the Dolly Partons across this country, that we can empower young people, whatever background they come from, to harness that potential. That I believe the future is bright for this country. So if you want to participate in that, then you know you can always come back to Jonesborough and participate, come to the festival in 3 weeks' time. Thanks very much. I don't know what you